This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is what happens when a country discovers that neutral is no longer a real option, quietly, procedurally, with paperwork, tariffs, boycotts, and stories that travel faster than truth. Because the new weapon isn't a missile. It's access to markets, access to legitimacy, access to the system that decides whether your factories run, whether your ports stay open, whether your people keep their jobs. And here's the danger. You don't feel it until it's already inside your economy. It arrives dressed as diplomacy. It signs itself as policy. It calls itself peace. If you want to understand how modern power actually works now, stay with me. Subscribe if you want the next layer when this gets worse. Because the signal you're seeing is not the strike, it's the countdown. Nothing you're watching right now is being driven by personalities, not leaders, not speeches, not outrage. The system is being run by something quieter. Interdependence, trade routes that look civilian, legal forms that look neutral, financial rules that look technical, but together, they decide who breathes economically and who doesn't. In the old world, power was enforced with force. In this one, it's enforced with permission. Permission to sell, permission to ship, permission to be seen as legitimate. And that permission is no longer automatic. It's conditional. Conditional on alignment, conditional on narrative, conditional on who you train with, who you sue, who you refuse to condemn. This is the shift most people miss. The system no longer asks countries to choose sides publicly. It waits. Then it measures behavior. Then it adjusts access quietly. That's why ships matter less than reactions. Exercises matter less than responses. And statements matter less than consequences. What looks like diplomacy is actually calibration. And the calibration has already started. Because once access becomes a weapon, every move becomes a test. For a long time, this system felt stable. Before alignment was declared. Before punishment was explicit. Before consequences came after. Wars, sanctions, votes. Now it happens differently. The most dangerous change didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived as normalization. Security cooperation became routine. Economic pressure became policy adjustment. Narrative framing became concern. Before, neutrality bought you time. Now, neutrality buys you scrutiny. Every action is logged. Every silence is interpreted. Every partnership is weighed for intent. And the shift happened slowly enough that most people didn't notice. That's why it worked. Because systems don't collapse when they shock you. They collapse when they retrain you. What used to be economic cooperation quietly became leverage. What used to be law quietly became positioning. What used to be diplomacy quietly became conditional access. You don't wake up one day excluded. You wake up measured. Measured for compliance, measured for usefulness, measured for loyalty without being told that loyalty is being tested. And once the measurement starts, the margin for error disappears. Because this system doesn't punish defiance first. It punishes ambiguity. And ambiguity is about to become very expensive. And then the system stops being theoretical. Because the first shock never arrives as a collapse. It arrives as a technical adjustment, a meeting that doesn't happen, a tariff that needs review, an aid line that pauses, a summit chair that stays empty. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, nothing you can protest in the streets yet. But suddenly, an export sector tightens. Suddenly, hiring freezes spread. Suddenly, numbers that used to be projections become warnings. And here's the critical detail. The damage is uneven by design. It doesn't hit elites first. It hits workers. It hits supply chains. It hits places where there is no cushion. Jobs tied to access, industries tied to permission, communities tied to markets they don't control. The system doesn't need to announce punishment. The market delivers it automatically. If you want to understand how pressure is applied without firing a shot, stay with me. This is where most analyses stop and where the real mechanism begins. Because this shock isn't the consequence. It's the test. What you're watching now is not retaliation. It's design. This is how the system actually works. Pressure is never applied directly to governments first. It's routed through dependencies, trade preferences, market access, financial credibility, legal standing. Each one looks separate. Together, they form a circuit. When a country benefits from that circuit, growth feels organic. When the circuit tightens, collapse feels self-inflicted. That's the genius of it. Because no one has to say, you are being punished. The system simply recalculates risk. Banks adjust exposure. Investors hesitate. Orders slow. And suddenly the question isn't sovereignty anymore. It's payroll who absorbs the damage. Not the architects, not the strategists, not the people who chose alignment. The damage flows downward to workers, to exporters, to sectors that can't reroute fast enough. Who benefits? The actors who control the switches, the ones who can deny access without appearing hostile, the ones who can say this is just policy. And here's the trap. Once you're inside this mechanism, every response you make feeds it more data. Push back too hard and risk rises. Compromise publicly and credibility falls. Delay and the market decides for you. This is not diplomacy anymore. It's systems management. And once you see the mechanism, you realize something more unsettling. The next shock won't ask permission. And this is where the tempo changes. Faster, tighter, less forgiving. Because once the mechanism is active, escalation doesn't come from speeches. It comes from stacking. One pressure point becomes two become overlap. Overlap becomes momentum. A market reacts before a ministry does. A rating moves before a vote. A partner hesitates before anyone explains why. Suddenly, uncertainty becomes contagious. Supply chains pause. Insurance premiums rise. Credit committees ask questions no one can publicly answer. And notice what's missing. There is no declaration, no ultimatum, no formal break. That's intentional because formal breaks create resistance. Ambiguity creates compliance. Every actor waits for clarity that never arrives. Every delay makes the cost of reversal higher. Every attempt to stabilize creates new exposure. This is how pressure accelerates without looking aggressive. Not through force, through friction, and friction spreads across sectors, across borders, across time. By the time leaders realize this isn't temporary, the damage is already priced in. Because the second shock isn't louder than the first. It's quieter. And that's what makes it irreversible. And this is the moment it stops being abstract. Because now it reaches you, not as theory, not as geopolitics, as constraint. You feel it when a shift is cut. When overtime disappears, when a factory explains a slowdown with words like external conditions, you didn't vote on alignment. You didn't negotiate access. You didn't attend the meetings where risk was recalculated. But you absorb the outcome. Prices move before wages do. Jobs disappear before explanations arrive. And the language stays clean: adjustment, recalibration, necessary caution. This is how systemic pressure hides its fingerprints. You're told it's temporary. You're told it's global. You're told it's nobody's fault. But your margin shrinks anyway. And here's the part most people miss. Once pressure reaches households, it starts reshaping politics from the inside. Fear changes patience. Instability changes tolerance. Economic stress rewrites what people are willing to accept. If this feels familiar, pay attention, subscribe, because this phase never stays contained. Because when pressure hits people before systems adapt, the next move is never rational. It's reactive, and that's where the risk multiplies. And now it stops being domestic. Because systems like this don't respect borders. They propagate What begins as a bilateral issue becomes a signal others can't ignore. Partners watch closely. Neighbors recalibrate quietly. Investors don't wait for confirmation. They watch behavior. They notice which relationships trigger consequences. They notice who gets access tightened and who doesn't. They notice how quickly pressure travels. And once they notice, they adjust preemptively. Trade reroutes. Insurance clauses change. Financing gets more conditional. Not because anyone issued an order, because risk has been redefined. This is how local pressure becomes global alignment pressure. One country absorbs the shock first. Others learn the lesson without being hit. That's the multiplier effect. Because remember, the system doesn't need everyone to comply. It needs enough examples, enough uncertainty, enough cost, enough evidence that neutrality carries penalties. And once that lesson spreads, the landscape changes everywhere at once. Suddenly, what looked like a regional decision becomes a global precedent. And that's when the question shifts. Not who is right, but who can afford not to adapt. Because from this point on, every country is watching the same signal, and none of them know how far it's going to go. From here, the system accelerates forward into three possible paths. Not outcomes, paths. The first is adjustment, quiet recalibration, selective compliance, symbolic distance without rupture. In this path, pressure is managed just enough to keep access open. Growth slows, but stability holds. The cost is autonomy. Decisions are shaped by anticipation instead of choice. Nothing breaks, but nothing feels sovereign anymore. The second path is erosion. Slow damage, compounded friction, confidence bleeding out over time. Here, pressure doesn't explode. It grinds. Jobs disappear unevenly. Politics polarize. Policy becomes defensive. Leaders spend more time containing fallout than shaping direction. The system doesn't collapse, but it hollows out. And then there's the third path, rupture, a miscalculation, a narrative that hardens, a response that triggers full disengagement. In this path, access shuts faster than alternatives can form. Markets freeze, alliances harden, emergency measures replace policy. What was once pressure becomes isolation. And here's the most dangerous part. None of these paths are chosen cleanly. They're stumbled into because the system never announces which one you're on until it's already too late to reverse. That's why this moment matters more than any single decision. Because the future isn't being decided by ideology. It's being decided by tolerance for risk. And the margin for error is disappearing. This is where I don't give you comfort. Because systems like this don't end with clarity. They end with momentum. Once access becomes conditional, every decision carries a shadow cost. Once neutrality is penalized, silence becomes a signal. Once pressure works, it gets reused. And here's the unresolved warning you need to sit with. The most dangerous phase isn't when power is abused. It's when power becomes invisible, when no one has to threaten you, when no one has to announce punishment, when outcomes feel natural, inevitable, unavoidable. That's how control survives scrutiny. So if you're wondering why this feels different, why diplomacy sounds thinner, why economics feels harsher, why alignment questions are appearing everywhere at once, it's because the system has changed, not the headlines. And this story doesn't end here, because what happens next won't be decided in one country, or one summit, or one court. It will be decided by how many times this mechanism succeeds without resistance. If you want to understand where this goes next, who adapts, who erodes, who breaks, stay with me. Watch the next chapter. Share this if you don't want this to stay invisible. Because once a system like this locks in, you don't get a warning. You get consequences.